Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by regulatorwatch.com. We all know nicotine vapes haven't been around for very long, yet their impact is monumental. Worldwide, nearly 100 million people have stopped smoking thanks to vaping, but the demonization and hysteria over safer nicotine products continue. Joining us today to discuss public health war on vaping and what could be the dawn of a new era of prohibition is Jacob Greer, the author of the 2019 book, The Rediscovery of Tobacco, Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette. And he's also a writer for Reason, a libertarian website and magazine. Jacob, thanks for coming back on the show.
Brent, thanks for having me back on.
Very excited for this conversation, though it is not a very fun topic. When we last had you on in October of 2019, it was just a couple of months after the so-called vaping-related lung disease exploded, and your book had also just been published. Let's start there. Provide our viewers with a quick snapshot of what you're trying to accomplish with the book, and what was the reaction?
Yeah, so it's a comprehensive book on the history of the regulation of smoking, essentially. And so I came into it with two goals, one of which was to talk about things related directly to smoking, such as smoking bans or prohibitions on things like menthol cigarettes. And then to also talk about the sort of new era of harm reduction, which has opened up in recent years, where we have much safer products like snus or vaping that smokers can use to get a source of nicotine that's much less harmful than smoking, but that had also been demonized quite a bit by the press and politicians and anti-smoking groups. And so I wrote this book to sort of delve into the science and also the cultural and political aspects of all of that to try to make a case for a more liberal approach to smoking and vaping, where we respect adult choice and promote harm reduction to move people away from cigarettes.
Why do you think it was important to delve so deeply into the history of tobacco use?
Well, I saw a lot of the same patterns repeating in the war on vaping that I saw with what got me into this topic in the first place back in the early 2000s, which was smoking bans. And if you go back to around 2003, 2004, and through the next decade, there's a lot of debate about where smoking should be allowed and if we should ban smoking at all bars and restaurants, and then extending that outward to patios and parks and beaches, and then finally into private homes. The case for that was always exaggerated, which is not to say there's no case for it, but the science behind it was often very out of touch with what they could actually prove, and seizing on very minute harms and blowing them up to look extreme, or using dubious statistical methods to promote ideas like you could reduce heart attacks by 60% in just a few months, by banning smoking in bars, none of which was very grounded in reality, but all of which got a lot of press attention. And accompanying this was, demonization of smokers themselves. And I saw the same thing happening going into the vaping debate, often with the same people, where there was certainly a lot of room for legitimate debate about this. But then on the other hand, a lot of dubious science and demonization of smoking or vapors that made it hard to have an honest conversation about it.
Yeah, and I think that, you really nailed that in the book. And it's the thorny issue for vapors is the corruption of science and what appears to be the destruction of truth. Are we just griping, or is it real?
Oh, I think it's very real. And, there's institutional reasons for that. Some of that is monetary. Obviously, there's a lot of money coming in from Bloomberg philanthropies and also from the Master Settlement Agreement that goes to fund anti-smoking or anti-vaping research. And I think it's more than that. It's also just cultural. A lot of the people who dedicate their careers to working in the anti-smoking movement, whether that's in nonprofits or whether it's in academia, they came up in an era when big tobacco really was evil and extremely dishonest. If you go back to the 90s and recall executives from the big tobacco companies testifying in Congress that nicotine is not addictive, and that's just one example of many that you could cite for the dishonesty of tobacco companies. So they grew up in this era of all-out war on big tobacco. And I think that made them ill-suited to adapt to modern times, where harm reduction is a very valid possibility, and where the tobacco companies are not the only ones doing this, but they are making products that, unlike, say, filtered cigarettes in the 50s and 60s, now actually truly are much lower risk, and that we could benefit public health by convincing smokers to either never take up smoking in the first place or to switch to these safer products. Well, I don't think there's just one enemy. It's a mix. There's politicians are the most obvious one. They're the ones who will be passing the laws that lead to vapor products being banned or other undesirable outcomes. There's also regulators at the FDA in particular who may be overly restrictive. And then there's the entire, very well-funded public health movement, like we mentioned before with Bloomberg Philanthropies and groups like Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. And at the same time, there still is big tobacco itself. They've contributed to setting up a regulatory environment in the United States where they would be the only ones who actually have the wherewithal and the funding to potentially get their products through this FDA process. So one reason we see so many small independent vapor companies getting put out of business right now is because of the law giving the FDA control over the entire tobacco market, which was pushed both by Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and also by Philip Morris and Altria back in the early 2000s.
Jacob, I have here for the audience the first article of yours that I'd like us to talk about, and it's bang on with the FDA. This came out in September of 2021, so right as the PMTA deadline had hit, and the article that you wrote was the FDA is set to unintentionally push quitters back to smoking. Now, did they do that?
Well, it's surprisingly still hard to tell. I think they will do that. But as we know, the FDA actually missed their own deadline that was imposed by a court to make the decisions on these vaping products. So as things currently stand, there are still a ton of e-cigarettes that, even though the FDA was ordered to rule on their applications back in September, they haven't gotten around to it yet. And so it's still a bit of an open question as to which products are going to stay on the market. And they also have yet to act on a bunch of other products like those involving synthetic nicotine, which they just got authority over. So the fact is right now, even though the FDA was supposed to have finalized all the decisions at this point, we don't know what exactly is going to remain on the market, although I'm pessimistic the way things are going right now. What looks like it's going to happen is that the FDA is going to be extremely skeptical of approving any e-cigarette in non-tobacco and perhaps non-mint or menthol flavors. So far, they've only given authorization to two, neither of which is a product that's actually used by many people. So we don't know what's going to happen with products like Juul, which are much more popular, or with the unlimited number of smaller independent vape companies that are out there. But obviously, the predicted effect of this is that if you take away the e-cigarettes that lots of adults are using to keep them off of smoking, and if you poll e-cigarette or users and vapers, they tell you overwhelmingly that tobacco flavors are not what they want. They actually want these fruitier, sweeter flavors. So you take those off the market, then one of two things is going to happen. One, they may go back to smoking if they don't find the other vaping products satisfactory. Or two, you may just see a really big black market in these products, where then the good thing is people would be able to get them still. But the downside is we would have all the problems with illicit markets and the potential crackdowns, which we'll talk about soon, I think.
Yeah, we'll get there in 1 second because that's the bleak part of this whole story. When it comes to FDA, I mean, have they been letting the public down as well as the vaping industry?
Well, I think the public is probably on their side because most of the public, doesn't smoke and doesn't vape. We've got about 34 million smokers in the United States, about maybe a little more than 10 million people who vape. So it is not a niche interest, but it's certainly a minority interest. And so I think they're responding to public pressure, which is, very anti-smoking, and then also bought into a very alarmist story about youth vaping. So no, I'd say they're actually doing what the public wants in some way, but what the public wants is very misinformed in this case, and will be very bad for the lives of smokers.
So you've been basically warning that this whole thing is moving towards a very dark area, and that would be a new prohibition on nicotine, basically, right? It's not just vaping products.
Yeah, essentially, and it's not going to happen all at once, and that's how we tend to think about prohibition or the drug war. We think about the 18th Amendment passing and the Volstead Act, and suddenly it's illegal to sell alcohol throughout the United States, and we think of the Controlled Substances Act when it comes to other illicit drugs, and how that creates an entire era of prohibition. And with nicotine and tobacco, it's probably not going to happen like that. Maybe it will someday, but we're not really looking at Congress passing a law banning all tobacco and nicotine across the board all at once. But what we are going to see is just kind of a snowball of regulations and product standards coming out on dictating what people can sell, And if you have enough of those, then you eventually reach a tipping point where you have created prohibition, whether you intended to or not. And so I think that's where we're headed with a lot of tobacco and nicotine products. With combustible tobacco, that the most likely outcome would be a ban on menthol cigarettes, which are used by, I believe, around 10 million smokers right now. So it's a really big market. And according to a recent survey, about 70% of smokers who consume menthol say that if a ban passed, they would try to obtain them from illicit sources. And then with vaping, again, there will probably always be some vapor products allowed on the market, but it might not be ones that smokers actually want or that vapers actually want. And so again, it's not that hard to either import these things from China or to create them here in the United States with nicotine, liquid, and flavors. These things are not that hard to obtain. So we'll probably see an illicit market in those as well, which might then provoke a police response.
So obviously, if there is a black market and vapors are kind of forced to participate in it, then that opens up to a whole host of potential criminal charges. And let me show the audience here. This was a big thing. I'm sure most of our audience has heard about this, but another vaping teenager faces violent police enforcement, and this was in Atlanta. And let's just watch this video.
Developing this morning, a family wants answers after an incident caught on camera and a policy on the Beltline police say was broken. Here's CBS 46's Sierra Cummings.
The family is frustrated after Atlanta police released the teen's name as he's a minor, but not the officer's name. This teen says he is traumatized after what happened on Thursday, and now he's not sure if he ever wants to come back to the skate park again. It was scrolling social media. The family of Terry and Forston saw the video of the teens tasing at the historic 4th Ward Park, posted to Atlanta Uncensored. Atlanta police told us they are reviewing the video they said is part of the encounter.
He wasn't ready for that. That really put him in a situation that he was never supposed to experience at his age.
Cheyenne Thomas picked up her nephew today after he spent Thursday in jail.
I really can't go to sleep right now because of that.
The 17-year-old skateboarder was charged with disorderly conduct. However, his lawyer argues the only conduct of concern should be the officers.
I was just chilling. I just hit a vape at the park. Then she came up to me aggressive.
APD cites smoking rules at the park, saying in his statement the officer advised him of the law, that he could not vape, but he walked away and continued, adding after trying to issue a citation, the teen would not comply, resisted, then was tased. Forston says there was no resisting. Family feels this was an excessive encounter.
I looked at the video. He never once charged at her. He never once approached her. She was scared because he's a big black dude.
I'm 17 years old. It would never went that far.
The incident is still under investigation, and the family plans to take legal action.
I think we'll probably see more of this. And this is the problem when you criminalize behavior or criminalize goods, especially things that are consensual, like smoking or vaping, is then you sort of invite, unfortunately, this type of police abuse. And we've seen that with the drug war, certainly. And I think we'll see more of it as we start to bring tobacco into this realm of illicit markets. And this wasn't isolated, by the way. There were two more very similar incidents that happened on the Ocean City Boardwalk, I believe it was last year. Two more cases where teenagers allegedly violated a ban on vaping outdoors. Police got involved, and it ended with teenagers being tased or arrested. So it's regrettably not that uncommon. It's not common, but it is something that happens. And I think when we start criminalizing sales of tobacco or nicotine, we need to be prepared for how that's going to be enforced. Yeah, we're just not learning the lessons of the drug war. And none of this is rising to the level of what has been perpetrated in the war on drugs so far. But I think if you paid attention to how the war on drugs led to police abuses and to moral panics, then it's hard not to see parallels with what's happening with nicotine and tobacco right now, especially with the way authorities treat people, whether they're minors or adults, who use these products.
Now, you write in one of your recent columns connecting a very major issue that happened that kind of sparked a lot of awareness for the Black Lives Matter movement. Why don't you explain that for us?
I believe you're referring to the death of Eric Garner right now. Yeah, so Eric Garner was, as most of you probably know, killed by a New York police officer in an incident that began with him allegedly selling loose cigarettes. And loosies, as they're called, are basically a way that people sell cigarettes to basically do a lower price, because you're not allowed to sell them outside of packs of 20, and taxes are extremely high in New York City on cigarettes. And when I talk to people in the anti-smoking movement or public health about this, they try to separate these two issues, and they say, well, this wasn't about the tax rates in New York or laws about smoking. This was just police brutality, and that's a separate issue. But I don't think you can do that. The reality is we have to deal with the police we have. And in the United States, we have increasing awareness that our police enforcement can be violent and abusive. And so when we start criminalizing sales of products like cigarettes or flavored vaping devices, police will eventually get involved, because states do want the tax revenue that they're missing out on from these illicit sales. And these are the types of things that will arise from it, tragically. And if not police abuses, then also just standard arrest and incarceration, which are in themselves very bad.
In terms of the black market, you wrote about this. We've seen some of this in Canada too as well. But I mean, really, organized crime is getting involved. Yeah,
on a massive level. And if you talk to people who've been involved with this, they see it just in differential tax rates in the United States. There's organized crime involved in bringing cigarettes from outside of New York and from places like Virginia with a much lower tax rate. I'd also recommend everybody check out a report in Vice magazine recently on tobacco in Great Britain, and the steps that people are going through to evade these tax laws. Not even a ban, just the tax laws are remarkable and reminiscent of what people do to smuggle drugs. There's stories of people in the back rooms of convenience stations where they push things through the floor or through hidden doorways so that they're out of view when enforcement comes in, but they're there, and it's a massive black market. We see it in Australia right now, which is extremely restrictive on vaping. It should be one of the hardest countries in the world based on their laws to obtain e-cigarettes, and yet people are just selling them on Uber and on social media apps. And they're an island country. Like, they have every advantage in the world. We saw it recently in Bhutan, which has famously been one of the heralded countries for banning the sale of cigarettes. And that just created a black market. And finally, during the COVID epidemic, they repealed their prohibition on this because they acknowledged that there was a huge cross-border trade. And finally, the pandemic made them decide that having this cross-border trade was worse than having cigarettes. And so they repealed it. There's a lot of overestimation, I think, in the public health world of that if you pass a law against some of these products, whether it's smoking or vaping, the compliance is going to be easy because they're used to standard regulations. They're used to saying, well, if we pass this law, a company like RJ Reynolds or Altria, who's a huge company that's legible that they can watch, is going to comply. And they're right about that. Those companies probably will comply. But what you are doing is then creating all these incentives to just smuggle things in from overseas, where you can't really control things. You can't control the cigarette trade in Belarus to China when those start coming in the United States. You can't control the same thing with vapes. And you might even see, small, hand-produced operations. Tobacco is a plant. It's not that hard to grow. It's not that hard to roll. So yes, it won't be as efficient as a big tobacco and their contemporary rolling machines. But I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing small operations pop up to create, hand-made menthol cigarettes or even standard cigarettes.
Here's an article from Reason that you wrote back in March of this year. Who will be the first person to go to prison for selling flavored tobacco or e-cigarettes?
And it's happening. Yeah, it may have already happened because, a lot of these cases never even really get reported. So we don't know if it's happened yet. But if it hasn't, it's probably going to happen soon. I could say the case probably involves a New Hampshire man who was arrested in Massachusetts for bringing in cigarettes, flavored e-cigarettes, and cannabis. And I forget the exact numbers, but the authorities seized a lot of cash. They seized a cargo van and a whole lot of products. He's facing up to 5 years in prison now. And that's a direct result of Massachusetts policies that made it basically impossible to buy flavored vaping devices legally. So they end up being supplied by guys like this. And then when the police crack down, it's only a matter of time before someone like him is sentenced to prison, and it's probably going to happen.
It was a couple of months after you were first on the show, and we had Ethan Nadelman on. And if there's one person in the world that you could say is responsible for, winning the war on drugs, if not beating it down, it is Mr. Nadelman. And, he said something very, very strong. He said there is going to be people going to prison over nicotine. And that was 2 years ago. And here we are sitting here with those same levels of warning that you're providing. I can't help but think that this is really not going in the right direction.
Yeah, completely agreed. And we'll only see more of it as FDA restrictions come into place on a national level, or as more states and cities pass these types of flavor bans.
So why do you think they don't accept harm reduction when it comes to this particular execution? I mean, most public health seem to think that harm reduction is okay for needle exchange, sex ed, condoms, that kind of thing. Even cannabis, the legalization of cannabis is made with a harm reduction argument, yet you just can't seem to be allowed to be making it when it comes to tobacco.
Yeah, and harm reduction is always an uphill battle, and we're seeing it succeed in a lot of places. I think part of it is that tobacco has just been so demonized for the past couple decades, or more than a couple decades, but it's been demonized and stigmatized so that no one can see it as possibly good. They view anyone who smokes as just an addict who has no free will in this situation. And they just have a lot of skepticism of anything that even looks like smoking. So regardless of what the science says on vaping, there's a lot of people who will look at that and say, well, you put it in your mouth and it provides nicotine and it produces this cloud. So it must be just as bad as smoking, if not worse. And so we see that perception, in polling. A lot of Americans think that e-cigarettes are as bad, if not worse, than cigarettes, which is just wildly out of touch with what almost any scientist who's researched this would say. So that's part of the challenge. But I think another thing worth bringing up, though, is that historically, when you look at fights for drug legalization or decriminalization, those have mostly come from the left. It was Democrats, it was people on the left who were pushing to legalize cannabis, for example, or like where I live in Oregon, to decriminalize pretty much all drugs, or allow therapeutic psilocybin. Whereas tobacco, the defenders of tobacco have traditionally been on the right. So people on the left are inherently skeptical of that. And I think they're just kind of biased and just taking a mental shortcut of thinking, tobacco is always bad. It's a right-wing issue. We're on the left. We're against it. Instead of actually looking at the science that's coming out on the potential of harm reduction to massively reduce both the harms of tobacco use and the number of people who smoke.
What do you make of the CDC's response and actions that they took around the so-called vaping-related lung illness, EVALI?
Yeah, well, I think it was completely inept. And I faced a difficult choice at the same time because the so-called EVALI epidemic was at its peak right when I had to decide whether to hit publish on my book. And my book was basically making the case, in a large part, that vaping was a safer alternative to smoking. And so for that to be coming out at a time when there was all these news stories about how vaping is producing an epidemic that's killing people, I had to be pretty confident of knowing what was actually happening here to put my reputation on the line and publish the book when I did. But it came out in September, and by that time it seemed pretty obvious that nicotine vaping was probably not even involved at all in this, and that the actual cause of these lung injuries was mostly illicit cannabis vapor products. And there were lots of reasons to think this, the main one being that vitamin E acetate was identified as the thickener that was causing a lot of these lung injuries. It was traced back by the magazine Leafly to the cartridge market for cannabis products. So this is all pretty well known, and it wouldn't make sense to use a thickener like this with nicotine. Just the chemistry of it would provide no benefit whatsoever. So it was pretty obvious what was happening here, but the CDC was just way behind just about everyone on acknowledging that it was coming from cannabis. And I think they viewed it as an opportunity to delegitimize vaping, which they were already concerned about. And so it was just pure political opportunism. Maybe not in the early days. In the early days, nobody knew what was happening. But by late summer and into the fall of that year, it was certainly obvious what the true cause was. And they did a great disservice to the country by trying to blame it on nicotine vaping, because it did create a durable increase in misperceptions of relative harm. And after that, because of the CDC, because of the media, because of various nonprofit groups, American perceptions of vaping now see it as much more dangerous than it is, especially relative to cigarettes. And so I think they set back the movement to take people, to encourage people to give up smoking and try a much safer alternative instead.
Let me ask you a bit about Reason. The magazine and website. They're a libertarian site. I would imagine most of their audience are liberty focused. What's been the reaction to your stories that you've been writing to that audience? It feels like you're doing a little bit of educating. Is that needed, and is that why? And are you getting good feedback?
Well, I'll say up front, I don't read the comments, so so I don't know for sure. I think that's generally a good policy. My impression is that Reason readers view my articles on this topic fairly favorably. I mean, they are a very libertarian bunch overall, and so they don't really suffer from that bias of viewing tobacco as just a right-wing issue that they don't want to touch. So I really haven't gotten much pushback from Reason readers when I write about these issues. They're, as libertarians, they're generally in favor of people doing much harmful things than vaping. So it's not a difficult case to make to them. Although, of course, it's always great to, like you said, provide that education, because it is an issue that not everyone necessarily knows anything about. So it is great to produce that background. I will say from experience, I also write about some of these issues surrounding smoking and vaping for Slate, and Slate is a much more left-leaning progressive publication, and I got a lot of angry responses when I write for them. So you can definitely tell where the audience is more receptive and where they're not.
But where are the allies?
So this is complicated. And this is one of the things that frustrates me writing about these issues, because I do come at it from not the typical background of public health. I'm a journalist for one, and I'm a libertarian journalist for two, and I'm also someone who enjoys smoking myself. I'm not a frequent smoker, but I like to have an occasional cigar sometimes, and that definitely puts me on the outs with a lot of people in public health. So our allies obviously are anyone with sort of naturally liberal or libertarian inclination to defend the rights of consenting adults to make their own decisions on anything, especially including drug use, which, not to use that pejoratively, but that's what we do when we smoke or vape. And then, anyone who's for, a limited government approach on this. And then on the left, it's more complicated. There are people, like you said, Ethan Nadelman, who is absolutely fantastic, who comes at this of a background of opposing the drug war and who sees the parallels that are happening right now and is warning about them. But I distinguish in the harm reduction community between people who are liberal and illiberal harm reductionist. And there's a lot of people who do see the value of trying to convince smokers to switch to safer alternatives, but who don't just want to nudge them that way, but they want to shove smokers in that direction. And so a lot of the people who I think are in academia particularly take this approach where they not only want to transition people to vaping, but they want to prohibit smoking in as many ways as they can, whether that's menthol or whether it's requiring complete elimination or near elimination of nicotine and combustible tobacco, or even just all-out prohibition, which you do see some people advocate. And so with them, even though they are sort of for harm reduction in that sense, I think they make a mistake in terms of pushing for these prohibitionist policies and underestimating how difficult it's going to be to actually implement them without all these negative unintended consequences.
Let me ask you that, and this is going to be difficult to kind of tease out, I think, in a question, but it comes down to public health in the US and Canada. They both really hang their hat on not just the teen vaping, but young person vaping, which means people who are of majority, who are of age, deciding they might want to vape. And that is that's next to teen vaping as being totally horrible. It's enough to destroy the industry if a 22-year-old decides on their own, who's never smoked before, to pick up a recreational, nicotine habit through a vaping device. They see that just as bad as a 13-year-old vaping.
Right, and we've seen that with some of the proposed laws that have come out to basically just set an age cutoff, or a year cutoff, I should say, where anyone born after the year 2000, for example, will never be allowed to purchase tobacco products. And that to me is just upsetting to the idea that adults should be able to make their own decisions. And I had the same experience. I had never touched tobacco in any form until I want to say I was 22 or 23. And then a friend introduced me to a cigar, and I loved it. And so the idea that the state should be prohibiting me from making that decision when I was 22, I think is absurd, and it's an affront to liberty. But yes, what you say is correct. I mean, that does come down to this sort of puritanical attitude that absolutely no one should be using nicotine, which I think is just out of touch with the facts about how nicotine is available now. That maybe that attitude made sense when the only way to get nicotine or the predominant way to get it was to smoke a cigarette. Because yes, smoking cigarettes is terrible. It is incredibly deadly. You can talk to millions of adult smokers who regret ever starting, whatever age they began. But the fact of the matter now is that, in a country where people consume alcohol really freely, where we're legalizing cannabis, the idea of being able to vape nicotine or use snus should not be very alarming.
Shouldn't be sent to prison for it either.
Well, you certainly shouldn't be sent to prison for it, yeah.